This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
The Ataris were really good computers. The view inside of Commodore was that the Ataris were, especially the 800, was over-engineered. Every person in Silicon Valley either had a close family member or a close friend who had been laid off by Jack. You know, we were not the golden children. We were not Apple.
This is an interview episode of Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. Neil Harris started at Commodore as a member of the VIC-20 launch team, then continued to be a writer, programmer, and product manager there. He moved to Atari, where he was from 1984 to 1988. There he was hardware products manager, director of communications, and director of publications. He worked on Atari Explorer magazine and wrote a bit for other publications, including Compute's First Book of Atari and Start magazine. He later moved on to the GEnie online service. This interview took place on March 31st, 2016. In it, we discuss Bill Louden, whom I previously interviewed.
I learned programming in BASIC while I was in high school in the early 70s. And then I worked as a computer programmer writing accounting software, which was pretty boring but paid the bills. And then in 1978, I saw an ad for a computer store looking for sales help. And I applied for the job and got a job at a store called Mr. Calculator, which was owned by Commodore. They sold a lot of Commodore calculators and the original Commodore PET computers.
Nice. Where was this located?
In Philadelphia, down Center City, Philadelphia, at 17th and Sansom Street. The PET computer showed up without basically any significant documentation, and there was a kind of underground of people exchanging information through user group newsletters and just basically hacking away at the computer to try to figure out what it did. And I contributed some articles and other information to that. And a few years later, after working at several other computer store jobs, went to work for a mail order company that was run by the guy who was the manager of our store. And anyway, so basically I had a long history of selling home computers, Commodores, Apples, Ataris, worked with a little bit of Radio Shack, and so, you know, basically all the home computers of the day.
Tell me a story about working at Mr. Calculator selling Commodore PETs.
Well, let me tell you, the first day I came in for my interview, and Commodore had run a full-page ad in the Philadelphia Inquirer. It's a little tiny store. It's probably, you can see my home office here, probably about this big. Giant line of people inside the store, mostly trying to come and buy calculators at discount prices. And over in the corner, there's this lonely computer there's one guy, Gene Beals, working in the store, trying to sell all the calculators. I come in at 2 o'clock, scheduled for a 2 o'clock interview, and there's no way he can talk to me yet. So I walk over to the computer and I start typing in little basic programs like, 10, print, quote, what is your name? 20, input N $, and 30, print N $, semicolon, and go to 30. People were like, ooh, awesome. Like, very simple basic stuff without any documentation, just trying to figure out what it'll do. And I kept the computer audience entertained for a few hours, and when the store closed and the manager could catch his breath, he did about 30 minutes of interviewing me and called me the next morning and asked me when I could start. So that was basically, the challenge in those days was that the computer store was owned by the company, and we had to sell everything at retail list price, and there were discounters across town. And so we did all the tech support because we actually knew the computer, and the other guys moved the boxes. So it wasn't exactly a very successful formula. But I got to know a few of the people at Commodore. And a few years later, my real foot in the door in the beginning of 1981, my mother called me up one day and said, I just heard on the radio that Commodore is having an open house and they're doing hiring. And I went, wow, that sounds amazing. And I had heard about Commodore's plans for a new color computer. And so I came into the open house and I talked to an HR lady, and said, look, I've worked with Commodore PETs. I know them really well. And I've heard that you guys have this color computer. Is there somebody I could talk to find out what's going on? And her eyes got really big. And she said, let me introduce you to Mike Tomczyk. And Mike was the product manager for the VIC-20. And he and I met. And I told him I knew how to sell. I knew how to write. I knew how to program. And his eyes got really big. And he hired me pretty much on the spot. So that was really my entree. If I hadn't been in the computer store and gotten to know the computer so well, that probably would never have happened. But really, there weren't very many people that had the kind of background that I had that led into that. So I liked writing games. I knew computers. I knew how to figure things out because in those days there wasn't a lot of documentation to go by.
So you were hired as part of the VIC-20 launch team? I
was. So in the U.S., Mike had a small team of people. I guess he had 2 other guys on the team before I got there. And after I arrived, I had a phone call from a friend of mine named Andy Finkel, who I'd known for many years since we were in high school. We didn't go to the same high school, but we were part of a little computer group through the local high schools. And Andy said he was looking for work, and he had also been a pet hacker back in the day. So I told my boss to bring him in for an interview and hire him on the spot, and he did. And he actually worked there for more than 10 years. So our team, in order to launch in the U.S., we were responsible for things like packaging, putting together software, putting together documentation. And literally my first week on the job, Mike said to me, we had this VIC-20 user manual written by an outside firm. It's actually a firm called Redgate that was owned by Ted Leonsis, who went on to AOL fame later on. And he said, the problem is the book is cute, but it's not really very informative. And I think we need to rewrite it. And I looked it over and I said, yeah, it really is very light on the content. So he said, okay, I'd like you to rewrite it. And I said, good, where's my computer? He said, well, we'll get you one, but we need you to start writing right away. So I went home that night, came in the next day with my Smith Corona electric typewriter from college and started typing. And over the next couple of weeks, entirely before I got a computer to work with at the company, I wrote the final draft of the VIC-20 user manual.
Wow.
And really, I like to enter into a new role with a goal in mind. And my key goal at Commodore was that future generations of home computer users would not have to be hackers to figure out how the computer worked. We were going to provide great documentation. So even in the basic user manual, there was a lot of real meat. And then later on that same year, Mike and I and Andy and another guy from England named Paul Higginbottom wrote the Commodore the Commodore VIC-20 Programmer's Reference Guide, which was kind of the manual. We didn't ask for permission. We included the schematics for the hardware and every entry point into the operating system that we could get our hands on. We knew that some of management would be taken aback by this. They thought this was valuable secret information so that we could do better software than anybody else. But we felt very strongly that having the entire world build software for our computer was better than us doing it ourselves.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That was a
I think we
lesson
were right on that one.
That was a lesson that Atari was slow to learn. Commodore was smart there. So I just back to the typewriter. When they finally put a computer on your desk, what was it? Was it a VIC-20 or was it a?
No, it was a PET. I got a prototype VIC-20 pretty early as well, but there wasn't much you could do with it other than write code because there was no software yet. So the PET was the word processor that I used. And the funny thing is, so we had a very small group of people. We were very underfunded. We could usually not get the resources. I told you it took 2 weeks just to get a computer on my desk. If we needed a printer or we needed a floppy drive, we had to put in a requisition, and we often weren't actually approved for the equipment that we needed to do our jobs. But we were really motivated, and we worked really hard, and we worked really long hours. So after 5 o'clock, when the alleged business software department next door to us went home, we'd go and take what we needed. And they'd come in the next morning and they'd have computers with cables and nothing attached to them. And they'd go get more stuff out of the warehouse the same day, and we'd have what we needed. They had what they needed. And, we were commandos. We were really
Wow.
had to get things done, and we just did whatever it took.
So what was your title when you were there? Did it?
Well, my title changed very quickly. The company grew and changed quickly. So I was hired as a writer slash programmer and became assistant product manager, the second in command of the team within a few months. By the end of the year, we had launched the computer, and the sales guys in the company found out that here was a guy who understood the technology but could actually speak to normal people as well. And I was drafted to be the sales engineer working with the sales team. So I was off with the vice president of sales, calling on companies like Kmart and Montgomery Ward, Kitty City, which was a big toy retailer at the time, things like that, traveling the country, doing the dog and pony shows, working the computer and letting him do the deals to try to get those accounts opened up. I was also going out with a lot of our regional sales guys, opening up more local companies and talking to computer store people and things like that as well. Mm-hmm. And then in my third year of the 4 years I spent at Commodore, I was tired of all the travel. And there was, well, let me step back. In year two, after we opened the deal with Kmart, part of the agreement was that we would train their store personnel on how to sell computers, which frankly was a wild goose chase because people didn't stay at the stores long enough to really absorb the knowledge and make it useful. But I was traveling. There were two teams of us who were traveling all over the country, going from region to region, training store personnel on how to sell computers. And I got really tired of so much travel. I was away a lot of the time. I had a young family at home. So I spoke with one of the vice presidents, Kit Spencer, vice president of marketing, terrific guy, one of the real heroes of Commodore US in that era, and said, look, I can write. I've done some publishing work before. We have a magazine, and the department head of that magazine has gone away. And frankly, the magazine was a typical house organ. It was full of articles on rah-rah, isn't Commodore great, and aren't our users swell? I said, I'd like to turn this into a real magazine. And, I'm happy to keep helping the sales guys, but I don't want to be traveling as much as I do now. But I think I can turn this into a real business and an asset for the company. So long story short is they gave me command of the magazines. And my last 2 years at Commodore, I was in charge of publishing 2 different magazines, got the circulation up to 100,000 on the newsstands and subscriptions. Launched the Commodore Information Network, which was our online support area on CompuServe, and I became very hooked on online, and was given a mail order operation where they launched a catalog store selling VIC-20 products, and then the person who was launching that left the company about a week before the catalog actually hit the mail, and we needed someone to organize actually how to ship the products from the warehouse and all that good stuff. So basically they said, well, it's print and we mail it to people, so let's give it to Neil because he knows how to do that. So, you do what you have to do.
Yeah. It sounds intense. Sounds like you had fingers in a lot of pies.
Well, that's what I like to do.
Yeah.
When a company is growing as fast as Commodore, and Commodore, when I joined Commodore, it was a $50 million a year business, mostly selling computer products outside of the U.S. There was a big European operation, very small U.S. operation at the time. And 3.5 years later, we crossed $1 billion in revenue, a lot of it driven in the U.S. The VIC-20 became the first million-selling computer in the world. The Commodore 64 became the second million-selling computer in the world. When a company's growing that fast, if somebody is smart and willing to work, you have many opportunities for growth and learning, and that was a lot of fun for most of us who were there.
Nice. Did you interact directly with Jack Tramiel?
Everybody worked and interacted directly with Jack Tramiel. Jack was, was the boss. You didn't. Most of the time, you didn't go out of your way to interact with Jack Tramiel because he was a little bit on the scary side, but more than a little bit. But I got along well with Jack, and I knew his sons pretty well. I got to know them much better at Atari, of course, but I knew his son Leonard, who was also a software guy and did a lot of reviewing of our books and materials and things like that. So yeah, when Jack came to town, you could tell he was in town even if you didn't see him because the energy in the building changed right away.
For the better, or?
Well, it depends on whether you were on the receiving end of a Jack attack or whatever else was going on.
Right.
There was one time, probably in my second year. So we started off in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, in a very small office, and then as we grew, we moved down the road to Wayne, Pennsylvania, and in Wayne, we had a conference room in the middle of the building, which had partitions that didn't go all the way up, and then all around the periphery were offices. And one day, Jack lit into one of the head software guys, who was a former football player and played center at a Midwestern university, major university. It was a big guy, and Jack was not, the biggest guy in the world, but Jack was giving him what for, and the entire staff of the company who was in the building were kind of standing around that, listening in, because it was really a classic Jack attack. I mean, one of the things that you learn very quickly is that don't tell Jack something if you're not sure you know what you're talking about. Don't make something up. Don't try to give him any baloney. If you don't know it, tell him, I don't know, but I will find out. And make sure that you know what you're supposed to know before you go into the meeting. And I think this guy made that mistake for the last time at that point. He stayed with the company for many years. It's not like he was fired. But, I mean, Jack was known for giving people the heave-ho on short notice if he felt that they were really making a mistake.
Wow. So, okay, you started on the VIC-20, and then you were there for the Commodore 64. Mm-hmm. You said you were there for 4 years total?
Yes. So the 64, one story I'll share with you quickly on the Programmer's Reference Guide is that one day I was off traveling the country, and I got a phone call from Andy Finkel. He said, look, I just got a draft of the Programmer's Reference Guide for the Commodore 64, which neither of us had worked on, even though we had worked on the VIC one. And I said, how is it? He said, it's fiction. And I said, uh-oh. And he said, yeah, I don't know where any of this stuff came from, but none of it actually works or makes any sense. So he called out the Marines, and the same team basically that put together the VIC-20 book dropped everything and worked night and day for the next several weeks and pulled all the material together. And fortunately, the 64 and the VIC-20 had a lot of similarities in technology. We could update a lot of the extra features of the 64, but we just did yeoman's work and pulled that manual together, which turned out to be a multi-million selling book as it went forward, and I think was really critical to building that software ecosystem for the computer at the time.
So at Commodore, what was your view of the Atari 800, 400 when they came out? Was it not as good? Was it something, how are you viewing the competition then?
So first of all, I was very familiar with the 400 and 800 from selling them at retail. One of the stores I worked at before I joined Commodore was a Computerland store, and Ataris were among our better-selling computers, and I always enjoyed them. In fact, I wrote a little bit of graphics software and was able to publish an article or two in Compute magazine with software for the Atari 800, and one of them made it into Compute's first book of Atari. So,
right.
I knew the
color wheel for the Atari.
Color wheel for the Atari. Oh, you've done some homework. Nothing fancy, but just some stuff to fool around and make pretty graphics on the screen. And so I knew the computer well. As a professional in the business, as somebody that enjoyed computers and understood them, I was never religious about my computer is good and your computer is evil. It wasn't politics. It wasn't religion. It's if you got a computer and it made you happy, then good for you. And if you bought a Commodore or an Atari or an Apple, you were probably happy. If you bought a TI or a Radio Shack, maybe not so much, but that was more, I just didn't think they were as good technologically. The Ataris were really good computers. The view inside of Commodore was that the Ataris were, especially the 800, was over-engineered in terms of, it was so robust in terms of hardware that it was very expensive to build. And that was Commodore's competitive advantage. And the Commodore computers, frankly, were at the opposite end of robustness. They they had some quality control issues and things like that. They had good warranties, so we made good on a computer that didn't work properly. But they were built to be as low cost as humanly possible. And one of the things we saw was that every time the production ramped up on the Commodore computers, Jack was able to cut the price because the cost kept coming down. And his rule of thumb internally was that whatever it cost him to build a computer, the retail price was about triple. So he would sell, if it cost him $100 to build, he would sell it to wholesale at $200 and retail price would be $300.
Okay.
And as you ramp up production, those costs come down. He would lower the price. Atari and the other guys would lower their price to match. At one point, Jack lowered a price, and the Atari people raised their price by a little bit. And Jack lowered his price again. And later on, we kind of heard through the grapevine that the Atari executive responsible for that was trying to send Jack a signal without breaking any laws that the price war needed to end so that we could all coexist happily.
Race to the bottom wasn't going to work.
Jack did not believe in coexisting peacefully. He believed that business is war. He said it many, many times. And if he could crush all the competition and keep all the money for himself, he was perfectly happy to do so.
Wow. All right, so let's talk about the transition out of your transition out of Commodore and into Atari.
Okay, so now we're up to 1984, January of 1984, Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, one of the biggest trade shows of the year for us. Jack is on stage at the show announcing that Commodore has passed the $1 billion sales mark, major milestone. And I'm watching Jack from the back of the auditorium, and I'm thinking, why doesn't he look happy? And it turned out that in meetings behind the scenes, he and Irving Gould, who was the chairman of the board, who was one of the prime financiers of the company in its early struggles, they had a falling out, and Jack was leaving the company. And a few days later, Jack announced that he was leaving. And honestly, it was like the air went out of the room. Just like I said, when you could tell when Jack was in town because there was a different energy level in the building, it was exactly the opposite, and it was permanent at that point. Executives started coming and going. Frankly, I was a computer guy, and I'd been in the industry for a while and watched it grow up, and we were bringing in people that didn't know what they were doing, one after another. One of the things that Jack liked to do was go to a show and launch trial balloons, and he'd show a computer or a printer or some other product, and he believed in his market research method was what he called the cash box survey. If he showed something and people wrote him checks, then he'd produce it. And we showed some products at that show that never should have made it to market, but they'd been announced. Jack was no longer around to say no, 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 and they ended up getting produced. Computers like the Commodore 16 and the TED, which were really designed because we were having yield problems initially on the graphics chips for the Commodore 64. So they made a computer with a simpler graphics chip, but in the meantime, they had solved the production problem, so there's really no purpose for that.
Right.
But the new management didn't get it.
I don't know the TED. Is that like the +4?
The +4 was initially called the TED, sorry.
Okay.
The VIC-2 chip that was in the 64 was simplified into something called the TED chip. So I was unhappy. I ended up moving into a different division of the company, the software division, just honestly looking for a safe haven to figure out if this was going to get better or if I needed to do something else. There wasn't a lot of other energy in the home computer industry in the Philadelphia metropolitan area. Some of my colleagues went to work for Sperry Univac, which was strongly present locally, but wasn't the kind of company that I felt comfortable was in the corporate business at that point. And then the word kind of started passing through the grapevine after Jack bought Atari that if anyone was interested, there were opportunities out there. So I was raised in Philadelphia. I lived in Philadelphia since I was 4 years old. and I had a young family, and we had to decide, did we want to make the call? And for career reasons, decided to see what was what. So I called Greg Pratt, who had been my boss at Commodore for a while as the COO of the company, was now COO at Atari. And I called Greg and said, so what's going on? Is there anything happening? He said, glad to hear from you. We have an opportunity for you. We'd love somebody to take over our magazines, our user group support, and help the sales guys, just like you did at Commodore. So they flew me out, and fairly shortly later, I guess by about August, I was on board at Atari.
Nice. And what was your span of time at Atari?
I stayed at Atari almost exactly 4 years. I started in August of '84 and left in August of '88.
Okay. Now, in my research, I saw you listed as Director of Communications, as Director of Publications, and Hardware Products Manager. Sounds like you had a lot of titles, jobs during your time there, too.
Well, if you think that's a lot, I had 17 different guys I reported to during that 4 years as well.
Wow.
I had to actually keep track at one point and count them all because they would come and go very quickly. It was, being the vice president of sales or vice president of marketing at Atari was not a long-term job career path for almost anybody.
Mm. So, all right, what did you start doing when you were dropped off at Atari?
So my first mission was to take what was left of the magazine department, which was the Atari Connection magazine, which had taken a lot of orders and not really delivered much, and turn that around. They didn't want to have to issue refund checks to a lot of people. They wanted to actually publish a magazine, and they were very comfortable with the fact that I knew how to do that and knew how to do it on a cost-effective basis. There were a number of other smaller projects that they asked me to do, and work on documentation and work on rebuilding user group support. They knew that I was very comfortable talking to the press, so I kind of became the spokesman to what they called the buff press, the computer hobbyist books. The management of the company wasn't really very comfortable with them and didn't trust the press at all. But you weren't talking to the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post if you came to them and to the computer magazines at that point, Antic and Analog, but also Byte Magazine and InfoWorld and people like that. I knew those guys from my time at Commodore, and I knew that if you talked to them and gave them the straight stuff, they would be fair. And 99% of the time, that was true.
See, you were there to announce some hardware. I saw your name attached to when Atari announced a big modem. I saw you were working. Your pet project was the Atari-based bulletin board system. So we're going to talk about some modems and BBSs and things?
Sure. Well, let's talk about online in general. Mm-hmm. So, as I said, I had been responsible for launching the Commodore Information Network. I had some people that did virtually all of the work, but I helped put the deal together and oversaw it. Got to know the people at CompuServe pretty well, including a guy named Bill Louden, who will come into the story a little bit later. I had also gotten my first email account and online account in my first year at Commodore in '81 on The Source. And I just generally liked online. I liked the idea of email and multi-user communication and things like that. So when I came to Atari, one of the first things I tried to do was rebuild the relationship with CompuServe and say, look, we had a good relationship at Commodore. We built one of the biggest areas on your service. Now that I'm at Atari, we'd love to do the same thing. And they said, look, we've already got this guy named Ron Lux, who's running the CompuServe Atari forums. So we'll give you a couple of free accounts, and we'll give you a bunch of introductory packages that you can put in your computer and modem boxes and get people on our service. And I said, well, how much of a percentage of the revenue will we get for that? And they said, well, no, the other guy has the deal. We'll just give you some accounts. You can provide support. And that was, I didn't like the deal. I was pretty sure that Jack Tramiel wouldn't like the deal. So we said, thanks, we'll provide some support, but, we'll keep our options open. So as time went by, I heard from Bill Louden that he had left CompuServe and ended up at General Electric, started the GEnie online service, and during their beta, he set me up with a beta account, and we started talking. And before too long, we became the co-managers of the Atari forums on GEnie. There was already a contract holder who was already earning a royalty for his management of the areas, but they basically gave us a comparable contract and made us co-owners of the area. And we said, good, on that basis, we can really get behind it. And we pushed hard, and we made it kind of the predominant place where Atari users could get their information. But in the meantime, we also provided support on Byte's online service called Bix, which was a very hardcore techie kind of online service that I liked very much, but was really never going to get huge.
Right.
We had online support on the Well, which was a West Coast-based service out of Sausalito.
Whole Earth Electronic Link.
Whole Earth Electronic Link. Good group of people, really interesting San Francisco-type characters there. And then we built our own BBS. I had a bit of an unusual office that was once upon a time a storage room, and they had moved all the stuff out of the storage room. It was this oddly shaped office kind of with a stairway going up above it, so the ceiling was not level. And I asked Greg Pratt if I could have the office. He said, well, but it's not really set up as an office. I said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll run the wires and hook up phone systems and make it my own if I can have it, because I was working in a cubicle in the marketing communications area, and I wanted a place I could have some peace and quiet and get work done. So he said, look, if you come in on the weekend and you run the wires and you make it work, you can have it for yourself. So that was my office. And right next door to that was a very small room, more of a closet. And a few months later, we set that up and started putting computers and modems in and made that Atari base. Eventually grew to 4 computers. In the days before local area networking, each line was a separate BBS system. We put all the same files to download, but if you had posted a message on line 1, you had to log into line 1 again, often by pure luck, if you wanted to see the response to your message. There was no other way to do it back in that day.
Terrible.
It was but it was extremely popular. Those modems were busy 24/7. We really used that as a way to disseminate a lot of shareware and freeware software as well as information. So people really liked it, and it was. I had a guy named Dave Duberman who worked for me for a while in the early going at Atari, who helped out on that board quite a bit. And we also had 2 guys who were San Jose police officers who were computer enthusiasts, Dave Flory and Greg Kronick, who were called our SysCops, who came in and did a lot of work on the BBS to keep it up and running as well. So it was we really had a good team there.
Nice.
I also was, so one day Jack Tramiel called me into his office, like, uh-oh, what did I do now? And it wasn't something I had done, something someone else had done. We had this big customer service department right outside of my office. It was really that entire section of the building. We probably had 20, mostly young women, answering the telephones, and 2 people running the department as manager and assistant manager, giant filing system. And these people had all been there from the old Atari. They had institutional knowledge and things like that, but they were set up to do basic support. And Jack called me into his office, very upset, said, look at this, these people are robots, we have to fire them and fix this. And he showed me this sheet of paper that had been sent out to a customer. It was like a 12th generation Xerox copy and there were about 6 or 8 paragraphs on the page, and each paragraph had a box that you could check off, which was the answer to your question. And the box that was checked off on the page was, I'm sorry, we cannot answer your technical question because we don't have technical support people in the department. And Jack found that to not be acceptable for a computer company. If you're a video game company, okay, but they hadn't changed, and the company had completely changed. We were much more focused on computers than on game consoles at that point. So I had 2 thoughts. One is, I can fix this, and the other is, I don't want to be in charge of customer support for the rest of my life here, and it's a job that doesn't really lead anywhere. So I was determined to fix it but not get stuck. So the first thing I did was I hired some technical people, and these were all young guys who were who were interested in computers, who loved the fact that they got a foot in the door, all of whom went on to to illustrious careers in the industry, and who I still am in touch with to this day. And I gave them the first project. I said, look, I want you to write a piece of software that lets you take these paragraphs and have them in a database, and the support person in the department can say, the person's question are answered by paragraphs 1, 4, 7, and 39, and it would print out on our brand new laser printer a beautiful letter that looked like it was hand typed that would answer all their questions. And if somebody has technical questions, they come to you guys and you give them a real answer for it. So we had 3 or 4 guys, depending on the time frame. They built the project for us. It was actually based on a word processing project I had written in the mid-'70s for a company during my accounting software days, but it was the same basic idea as what they had done, except it didn't look, it didn't look terrible. It didn't look like an amateur company. It looked professional. So it accomplished 2 things. One, it gave them something to do aside from answer phones and technical questions all day long, which can really burn people out. And it gave us a product and a process that made us look much smarter and much better. But in the meantime, I worked with the people in that department so that they wouldn't run afoul of Jack Tramiel, and I was able to, after 6 months, say, Jack, everything's going fine now. You really, I'll be happy to help, but you don't really need me to do this as my main role anymore.
Nice. And your role changed to?
Well, whatever you needed me to do. Depending on who the boss was. So when Mike Katz came on board, and I think you talked to Mike Katz somewhere along the line, right? Yeah. Mike had been around the consumer electronics industry, had been at Coleco for the launch of the Coleco Atom. Mike came on board, spent probably, I want to say about a year, and I reported to him as his kind of marketing and tech support guy. And worked with him on working the computers and video games when we were filming commercials, helping him make sure that we got the facts right. Still continued throughout my entire time at Commodore and Atari, going out on trips with the sales guys to make sure that that they had somebody that could talk technically when they were doing a sales job with the computers. Yeah, I'm not sure what else to say about that. I mean, just right. the role kept changing and evolving.
Sure.
One of the things that I worked hard on, probably starting more in my second year at the company, probably starting in '85, was really building up the user group support piece. Felt that this was our army in the field of zealots who were really invested heavily in helping the company grow and succeed, more than in most places that I've seen, probably more than the Commodore people in terms of, the company, had a lot of cachet in the marketplace, but had not really been the premier player in the home computer market, and really saw Jack as somebody that could, that got the computer side of things and could make it work, and they were really on our side. So we really went the extra mile for the user groups, supported them doing shows all over the country. Probably my third year in the company, I spent 26 out of 52 weekends away from home at a user group show somewhere in the U.S.
Wow.
Yeah, that was kind of a lot too. My wife was not really thrilled about that concept, although she did enjoy the one in San Jose that where she could actually see how it was working and brought our young kids along. But as much as anything, it was support for the user groups, and it was support for all the software companies and hardware companies that were supporting the product. And we all got pretty close during those days. At the user group shows, what you didn't see if you were a member of the public was the fact that when the doors closed, we all hung around and played MIDI maze together all night long. For days afterward, I would have this cramp in my hand as if I were getting arthritis at a young age from those Atari joysticks, and 6 hours straight shooting David Small in the back and things like that. But everybody in the whole software and hardware support community really got to know each other pretty well during those times. It was really fun.
Nice. You drafted the red herring perspective for the IPO.
The initial draft, I think that what finally went out the door was probably quite different than what I drafted, but they gave it to me and said, and I said, look, I'm not a lawyer or a finance person. At that point, I hadn't been to business school, which I did many years later. But yeah, I drafted the first draft, and they needed somebody to fill in a lot of the blanks. I think they did a lot more drafts after that and made it an appropriate legal document to do the IPO.
Sure. I found a Usenet post from you from May 12th, 1987. You're talking about the XE game system, and I can't decide if I'm trying to read it. It's like, are you being defensive here, or do you believe what you're saying? And so you said, so what we have with the XE game system is essentially a 65XE in disguise, and then you give some technical stuff. You said, physically, it's more appealing to those who don't want a computer, but do want to play games. And I don't know, I just wanted to know, did you believe this? Did institutionally they believe that the XE game system was a good idea?
Well, I don't know. I don't remember it.
Okay.
That's 30 years ago.
No, I get that answer a lot. It's okay.
Yeah, that's not one that sticks in my mind as one of the more important milestones during the time there. Mm-hmm. From what I vaguely remember, now that you brought it up after all these years, is that in fact it was just basically like, we've got all these games, and why don't we repackage it into a game system and see what the market thinks? So that was the theory. We put the word out there. Basically, what you had to understand also is this: I was the front spokesperson for a lot of this stuff. So Sam Tramiel or Sig Hartman or whoever would give me the word, and I'd pass it along. I mean, I wouldn't. I wasn't going to make things up on my own. But if somebody said, "Here's our strategy," that's what you take and you run with.
Sure. I found a great article written by you, Start Magazine, February 1989, called "ST 1999," about the future of the Atari ST.
Thank you for saying that. I love that article, and I've gone back and looked at it and said, actually, I got a lot of predictions pretty well on target.
I'm going to talk about this briefly. Your final closing paragraph says, in the 21st century, the ST will listen as well as speak, read as well as write, send and receive information without close supervision, and even reason after a fashion. This is a tall order for today's engineers, but clearly foreseeable using present and emerging technologies.
So that article is my swan song. Okay, I wrote that article after I left the company. It was the last article I wrote for one of the Atari publications, so the part I got wrong was that it was the ST doing all that stuff. But basically, had been doing a lot of thought about what was working and what wasn't working in the industry, and a lot of what was hard to do was the fact that, for example, if you were a corporate user on an IBM PC and you wanted somebody to, if you wanted your computer to have all your contacts in, you probably had an admin who could type all that information into the computer. For any one of us regular people that didn't have that resource, that was an unbelievably boring and tedious chore that we weren't ever going to do. Today, you hold up a business card, take a picture of it with your iPhone, and it gets zapped into your contact lists and LinkedIn and everything else. So the idea was you could kind of take what was really tedious and see, is there a path that makes that better? And you could see a lot of these things coming. And it was hard to tell if it was going to come next Thursday or 10 years later, but it was the logical thing. But part of it is I was a Trekkie from way back. In fact, that's one of the things that Andy Finkel and I had in common in the old days. We used to go to Star Trek conventions in the 70s. And, neither of us wore costumes or pointy ears or anything, but we just love science fiction. We love the future. And the dream has always been that computers should work like the way they work on the USS Enterprise. You talk to them, they respond, they do a lot of things automatically. And we're getting closer. The iPhone is getting really close to what you could do on Star Trek. And so was kind of the approach there is, there's emerging technologies coming down the road and the stuff is going to be better and easier to use. A lot of the things that people tried early on, like Checkbook Manager, we wrote a Checkbook Manager for the VIC-20, and nobody used it. And years later, Quicken made it really easy. And that's what that article was really all about. What things will become possible with better technology than what we have today.
Nice. So tell me about how and why you left Atari.
So Atari was a roller coaster, and I listened to actually a number of your podcasts before we did this talk today, and saw that you talked to Nick Lefevre, who was an old compadre of mine, and who also lives, we both live in the D.C. metro area, and we've gotten together a couple of times in recent years as well. And Nick had talked about the fact that Commodore was more fun than Atari, and I think in general, that was my experience as well, mostly because Commodore grew the entire time we were there up until Jack left. And Atari, we came in, Atari was a disaster area, right? Atari had completely fallen apart, lost a ton of money, and was left rudderless for the better part of a year before Jack came in. And we had, I mean, it was just a giant mess to clean up. A year later, we had launched the new computers, and we had some significant momentum, rebuilt the business. And then for whatever reason, the company bought the Federated Group, the consumer electronics stores based out of California. And I remember, this will tie back to what we talked about earlier. Gary Tramiel, the youngest of the three Tramiel sons, I said, Gary, why are we buying Federated Group? It's really having a hard time. He said, well, you and I both worked at Mr. Calculator back in the day. We know retail. We can make this work. And I thought, my God, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue retail chains scattered all over the country with these gigantic stores versus 15 small stores the size of my home office that failed. I mean, and there were several of us in Atari, Nick and myself and a couple of other guys who would go out to lunch, talk about the fact that Federated was a disaster, and the worst thing that could happen to you at this point in your career at Atari was being moved into a role at Federated, and that we were all comparing notes on what job opportunities were out there. And so sure enough, about 6 months before I left Atari, they asked me to go fix the computer departments in Federated and make that my full-time role. And I was like, uh-oh, this is it. It's the kiss of death.
Yeah.
And sure enough, I was traveling all over, driving my car to the Federated stores all over Northern California and flying down to Southern California, and came back to Jack with a plan and said, look, Jack, one of the things we need to do is improve the lineup of computers and products that we put in the stores. So not just sell our own stuff, but we've got to sell other people's stuff just like any other store. We've got to sell add-on graphics cards for the IBM PC. And Jack's like, we've got a warehouse full of graphics chips. We'll sell our own graphics chips and not their graphics chips. And I thought, okay, that can't possibly work. I know why he wants to. I mean, we had a lot of inventory left over from the old days, even a few years into the new Atari. But, there was no market for that. That's not what people were looking for. And he said, we don't have a competitive advantage if we're selling other people's stuff. We only have a competitive advantage with our stuff. And I thought, well, we've got stores and we've got customers. And if they want to buy something, at least we can make a few dollars selling something else if that's what they really want versus our own. But it was one thing after another. There just didn't seem to be any way. And really what was discouraging is I'd spent a lot of time working with these software and hardware vendors, getting to know them well, trying to build them up because that was part of the ecosystem that would make our computers successful. And the people who were directly managing Federated wanted me to help them arrange to buy a ton of this stuff on credit that I knew that these guys were never going to get paid for. And, business is business and it's tough and you've got to look out for yourself, but I just didn't have it in me to go down that road. It's, maybe I'd be a billionaire today if I was wired a little differently, but I just don't like to do things like that. I don't see how you can look at yourself in the mirror. So I was keeping my eyes open, and then I heard that the marketing director at GEnie had left the company kind of suddenly. And I thought, I'm very active on GEnie. I know Bill Louden going back years. Let me give him a call and see what's up. And I called Bill, and Bill said, I was going to call you in an hour.
Nice.
And I said, great. I'd really be interested in, I think I could really help you a lot. I really love the service, know it. I spent most of my spare time on GEnie versus the other services. And I know the whole industry really well. I think I could be a real asset. And they flew me out there, and I interviewed with Bill and with his boss, the VP of marketing at that division of GE, and fairly soon had an offer. And and also, I grew up in Philadelphia. GEnie was based in D.C., which was close enough by to visit. And my parents were getting older, and my mother was very ill at the time and actually passed away only a few weeks after I moved back to the East Coast. Young kids really wanted to be back east. If I could have talked my wife and my wife's family and my family and all our old friends to move to the West Coast, I would have been perfectly happy. And Silicon Valley was the place to be. But I had personal reasons as well as professional reasons to be back.
Sure.
It was also hard for Atari people who were Tramiel people to get other jobs in Silicon Valley because Jack was not the most popular guy in town. Probably every person in Silicon Valley either had a close family member or a close friend who had been laid off by Jack because of the thousands of people that had to be let go during the transition. So, we were not the golden children. We were not Apple. We were successful, and I remember Sig Hartman, I guess, the VP of software, saying that he was talking to somebody from Apple saying, we work for the toughest guy in Silicon Valley, and that's how tough we are. And he said, you're not tough, you're stupid. And you had to hear it in Sig's German accent to really get the full flavor of being stupid. But, that's how they looked at us. Jack was voted toughest boss in Silicon Valley 3 years running by Microtimes magazine. And, that wasn't exactly the style over there. Jack was much more of an old school European style businessman, and wasn't really a good fit. And it reflected on the rest of us, regardless of what our roles or responsibilities were.
Yeah. So before we move into GE, you mentioned something I want to go back to. You said about the competitive advantage of selling your own products. Is that what led to the Atari PC compatible? Which I think you were there for that, and I read some articles with you touting it, and it's just hard to believe that anyone would really, truly be behind that.
Honestly, I probably have less memory of that than even the XE game system. Okay. That would have come at the very end of my tenure there. So I'm not sure I could really add anything to that. I think Jack was counting on his expertise in low-cost manufacturing to give himself a competitive edge there.
Sure.
I think there probably were more pieces that could have been brought to the puzzle. But it's not something that I was really closely involved in.
Okay. So was there any drama when you left Atari, or was it just your standard, here's my 2 weeks notice, see you later?
Well, it was actually not even quite that. So one of the ways you had to work with the Tramiel family at Atari was, especially with Jack, but to a lesser extent with Sam, who I was pretty friendly with, is you'd go up to their office and you'd talk to their secretary, and you'd see if they were in a good mood or a bad mood that day. And if they were in a good mood, you'd ask for a chance to go in and sit and talk. And if they weren't in a good mood, you'd beat a hasty retreat and live to fight another day. But I was given a job offer, and it was time to go. And I went up to Sam's office, and Sam was not having a good day. And I was like, I don't really have time to wait on this one. I need to get this thing going. So I went into his office and said, look, I'm sorry, it's been great working with you for almost 8 years now, but it's time for me to move on. I've been given an offer to work for GEnie. I'm going back to the East Coast. And, I did not get the most warm and fuzzy response at that point. And honestly, I think things were not going well for the company. I had, I think, lunch with Leonard and Sam some years later, and they said, yeah, Federated was a pretty big mistake. I said, really, you guys realized that it was a mistake? He said, it was like $250 million that it cost us. So, yeah. Things, and I don't think they were happy about people jumping ship, but it was time to go. It was really just, it was just not something where you could win the battle anymore.
Okay. Right. All right. So now you're at GEnie, and you were there for 5 years, and you were director of content and marketing. Tell me all about that.
So let's step back to my first interviews there. So I told you I talked to Bill Louden and his boss, but I also talked to a lot of the staff people because I knew them pretty well. Went out to lunch with a bunch of them, and there were really two people in marketing at GEnie. There was the guy who had left, who was more of a product guy, who was responsible for product marketing and bringing new products onto the service. And there was a woman named Jean, who was the marketing person, the one who did advertising and promotions and stuff. And at lunch, Jean kept asking me questions about what I thought of Quantum Link, which I had known from, they had kind of knocked CompuServe out of the game when at Commodore and taken over. And I said, they're a really good company, and they actually really get it. They have a really cool user interface that's much more focused on the computer and not focused on being a VT100 emulator. Not just text moving around on the screen, but a true graphical user interface. Really the only one out there that had that. I thought they were, pretty sharp. By the time I actually started my first day of work, Jean had left the company and gone to work for Quantum Link. And Jean ended up becoming Gene Case and marrying Steve Case.
Oh, there you go.
So
I think he did well. He did well for himself.
They both did well for themselves. Gene Case, very, very smart. Also, one of the people that got the business. Worked there for a number of years before building a relationship with Steve and moving on from there. And I don't really know anything about their personal life, but clearly one of the sharp people in the business, was clearly one of the sharp people at GEnie. Felt it was time to move to a bigger growth opportunity. But what ended up happening was they gave me both jobs. So I was responsible for continuing to build the product line, but also for marketing customer acquisition. So the first year was much more focused on building the product in terms of GEnie had a number of holes in its product offering, I felt, based on what I'd seen on CompuServe and Bix and everybody else. So I worked really hard at bringing in people to fill up those holes. And we added, I think, 45 different forums and services during that course of that first year. We worked really hard, and it kind of wasn't the culture. I was used to a fast-moving entrepreneurial culture at Commodore and Atari. GE wasn't like that. GE was, you put in your time and you collect a nice pension someday, especially this division. GE is a great company. This is a division of the company that ended up getting sold off a few years later. Did a lot of really interesting things, had a lot of really interesting opportunities, but, didn't quite have that whatever. A lot of people went on to great things from there, but great things didn't always happen in that organization. But anyway, added a lot of products, brought the Science Fiction Writers of America and built a giant science fiction area, built the gaming side of the business, brought in a product manager, brought in a lot of game products. We had an advantage in games, aside from the fact that I liked them and that Bill Louden liked them. We also have the lowest latency data network of any existing network at the time, purely by luck. Wasn't designed to be a gaming network, just happened to have lower latency. So lower latency made for better performance of the game. So we went after not just games themselves, but all the gaming companies to do support on the service. Went after Microsoft, went after Apple, all sorts of special interest forums and things like that, really built that up. And over the next several years, was more focused on building up the size of the audience through marketing communications, through putting brochures in boxes, built a lot of tracking systems so that we could measure how everything works. Not very sexy for your audience for this podcast, but something that was really different about being online and online businesses versus retail businesses. At Atari and at Commodore, you'd put a commercial on television, someone would walk into Kmart and buy a computer, but you could not always, or usually even, connect the dots, right? Somebody could have walked into Kmart because they saw it, they happened to be walking in to buy a rake and they saw a computer.
Right. It's impossible to track, correlate the two.
Right. Or their next door neighbor bought a computer, so they bought a computer. But when you're working online, you can track pretty much everything. And it's now gone to the nth degree with what's happening on the internet, where as soon as you look at a product on a service, you start getting ads for it everywhere. With what we were doing, we put a different code on every brochure that went into a modem box, and if somebody responded to that code, we knew exactly, and we tracked that, so we knew which offers, which brochures. We did a lot of experimenting. And so we'd know which version of a brochure in which modem box, whether it was a Hayes modem or a Zoom modem, and whether it was a different offer or a different color brochure. And we'd be able to measure. We knew we did 100,000 of them. We got a 5% response. We got a 6% response. So the better you did, the more you would do of that version next time around, which was actually horrifying to the people at that division of GE, because it was the kind of culture where you'd move very slowly and you'd study something and bring in consultants, and you'd roll out something that you knew was going to be perfect 2 years later. But in technology, you don't really have that opportunity because the landscape moves so quickly that if you wait 2 years, you've already been passed by.
Right.
So I would run experiments where you'd put out a brochure, and you'd do 80% of the print run of brochures would be whatever did best last year. And the other 20% you divide into smaller cells where you would test out different things. And the fact that you'd perhaps do a test cell that might fail completely was horrifying. People would get fired. It was like a James Bond movie where if you failed, they'd push the button, you'd fall down into the tank full of sharks. And that was the attitude that people got. It was like, of course, this is how you do it. How else do you learn in a timely basis? But the other conversation I had fairly early on was with our finance guy. And I said, look, one thing I don't understand, his guy was named Larry Signora, a very good guy. Larry, this GEnie should be growing 50% a year. AOL and Prodigy and everybody's going crazy out there. We should grow 50% a year. And he looked at me like I just climbed out of my flying saucer. And I said, what? And he said, look, in this company, if you say you're going to grow 50% a year and you grow 49%, you missed your numbers and you're in big trouble. If you say you're going to grow 10% and you grow 11%, you get a big bonus and you can go golfing every Wednesday afternoon. And I said, well, man, I'm in the wrong place. The culture is just so different than what I was used to, and different than what it takes to succeed in this marketplace. GEnie, the GE Information Services owned its own global data network, had its own email system, had its own consumer online service. The list goes on of all the multi-billion-dollar opportunities that they did not take advantage of because they were focused on electronic document exchange, which is an important business, but not something that turned out to be the global world beater. They were interested in something they could sell to the Fortune 500 corporations, and that's great. But they were so focused on selling to other people just like them that they didn't focus on the fact that there was this giant emerging market opportunity that could be really successful, that the company had the core expertise to do.
Doesn't sound like you were very happy there.
I learned a lot. Part of it was a lot of fun. Building the game business was a lot of fun. So GEnie was an oasis of cool, fun, interesting stuff that grew a lot. It was double the size that it was when I started at the time I left. But we were part of a larger organization that didn't respect us. And at Commodore, the VIC-20 group didn't get respect from the other department that was there when we started. The head of the software group for the alleged business software told me a few weeks into my tenure that the VIC-20 was the toy that they'd give away free when you bought a real computer at Commodore. Nice. And a few years later, we had taken the whole place over, right? The VIC-20 took over, and the PET was, the sideline business. That could have happened at GE Information Services, but was never allowed to happen. We were always kept in the corner as this little tiny business that didn't have the opportunity to grow. Very profitable. In fact, when GEnie finally started failing after I left, when AOL really started kicking its butt, much of the profit of that division evaporated, and I think the division president lost her job. And it was because they just weren't really watching. They were, I don't want to put them down because I learned a lot from GE. First of all, GE sent me to Crotonville, which is their management training institute. It's basically like a private university that GE ran themselves. I had gone to Cornell University out of high school, dropped out, become an itinerant computer programmer, and I found that I liked education again after I was at GE, mostly because I knew what I wanted to do with myself. So I went back to school and got my college degree that GE kindly paid for while I was there. So I learned a lot. I learned a lot about how big companies work. I learned a lot about organizing finance and process and things that were really important later in my career. But I looked at GEnie as being something that had amazing potential and was a lot of fun and had a great community and just was not allowed to thrive. Atari didn't ultimately become the world-leading computer company at that point, but it wasn't for lack of trying. We all were on the same page and doing our very best. At GEnie, it was like, we were just being held back.
How'd your time at GEnie come to an end?
So in 1988, so Bill Louden had left GEnie, and the new guy who was brought in, John Barber, was more of a consensus builder, where Bill was much more of a, I'm the boss and I'm gonna make the decisions and do what you're told, much more of an entrepreneur. And I like John very much, very good guy. The problem was I was really the only true marketer in the organization. And when we started making marketing decisions by consensus, and I'd get outvoted 5-1 on an ad campaign, and I'd say, look, it's a really cute ad campaign, and it makes me laugh, but it doesn't actually sell the product. And selling the product has got to be the most important thing, not the afterthought. And I'd get outvoted on that. I said, and that was starting to be challenging. And then when the decision was made that we had been so successful that we had filled up our mainframe computers and we weren't allowed to buy more computers, so we had to change our pricing so that we'd have less business. I said, I've never seen that not kill a company. So my last 6 months in the company, I took 24 credits and completed my degree. 24 credits is about 6 full-time courses?
Mm-hmm. That's a
while working full-time and having a family, because a month after I finished my degree, I was out of the company. It was just time to go. And in fact, they launched an ad campaign and changed their pricing and basically started the destruction of the business. But also, frankly, I'm much more of an entrepreneur by nature, and that was the way of things at Commodore and Atari. Is very entrepreneurial, not very corporate at all. And I was at the point in my life where my kids were still young, and I had some money in the bank and a wife with a job. And I said, I need to try being an entrepreneur and being my own boss and seeing how it works. And if it doesn't work, I can always go get a job. And frankly, given the hindsight, I probably should have taken a job at AOL instead. But I'd be rich living on my own island today. But I joined Simutronics, which was a video game vendor, mostly of fantasy role-playing games. I'd known the guys really well. In fact, I was playing their games in beta when I was still at Atari. And I called them one day and said to David Watley, the founder of the company, David, I think you guys have great games, but the only place you're selling them is on GEnie, and there's a big market out there, and there are a lot of companies that would love to work with a company like Simutronics that knows how to build online games and build more stuff. I think if I joined your company, we could really make something big out of it. And I said, look, I know that you guys aren't making much money. I think their total revenue from GEnie at that point was about $90,000 a year, and they had 4 full-time people, and they were basically living in their parents' basements and eating beans at every meal. And I said, look, I'm going to come on board if you let me. I'm going to work part-time and do some consulting work to pay the bills. But my goal will be to do the deals that let you guys really grow. And in return, what I want is I want to get a salary once there's enough money to get a salary, but in the meantime, I just want a piece of the company. And we shook hands and did the deal. I started doing consulting work. In fact, I doubled my GE salary that first year doing consulting, because how many people out there could do consulting and say, I'm an expert in the online business, with so many other companies coming in? Microsoft was a big client of mine for the first year. It was fantastic. Um, and I ended up doing deals with AOL, Prodigy, CompuServe to get all of Simultronics games on all the online services. Plus, we did deals with most of the major game and media companies like Viacom and Time Warner to get new products out the door, and made the Inc. 500 list in a few years. I mean, it almost, sometimes you think you have the magic touch, but we were certainly in the right place at the right time, which was the part that I kind of got. I said, if anybody's going to do well in the online game space, it's going to be these guys, but it's not going to happen unless somebody's out there pounding the pavement. So I was out going to conferences, taking meetings, making phone calls, and honestly, it was great fun, and we had a great more than 15-year run of success with that organization as the industry kept changing, but it was really a good time.
Nice. What do you do today?
I do a lot of things, just like always. I'm on the Gaithersburg City Council. I'm an elected official as of November. I was on the council for a year before that, being appointed to fill a seat, and that's going well, and I'm really finding it interesting. I'm teaching 2 college courses currently. One is called The Business of Video Game Development out of University of Baltimore, and the other is the Intro to Marketing class at University of Maryland. Really enjoying that. And I've actually just taken a job. I did a consulting project for a big data analytics firm based in Europe, and they offered me a position to be their head of business development here in the U.S. So I'll be flying out to Budapest on Saturday night and getting up to speed on their tools and techniques and processes, and hoping to start an interesting new chapter. I think it's a really cool company. As you could tell from my talking about looking at the data for these marketing programs, analyzing data is something that I've always really enjoyed. And so the modern state of big data analytics is not sitting at your Excel spreadsheet and trying to find a good number in it. There's all these amazing tools and visualizations and stuff. So I'm really looking forward to that as well. Nice.
Awesome. Do you still have an Atari or even a Commodore computer?
I actually still have the Commodore PET from my desk, the 8032 with the extra 64K memory board in it.
Nice.
I actually was missing one cable, and somebody sent me one recently, and I thought, wouldn't it be cool to do an unboxing video of a 30-year-old computer that's in a tattered old box in my garage, but I kind of never gotten around to that. I'm pretty sure that the whole system, at least the CPU I know still boots up. And you can type BASIC, but hopefully the floppy drive works. The printer, who knows after all these years.
Sure.
And I have an acoustic coupler that goes with it, which is really, most people don't even know what on earth it would be, because there's no telephone handsets that fit in it anymore.
Right. My iPhone doesn't fit in this.
That's exactly right. And I do not have, I had an ST for many years, and eventually, I don't know whatever happened to it. I'm sure I didn't throw it away. I'm sure I must have found a good home for it, but I don't remember. And I had quite a good collection of software for that too. And I still have a VIC-20 in a box somewhere, and I had a portable SX64, which was a cool little computer. I think
fun.
Yeah, it was a great one to throw in the back of your car, drive to your friend's house, and play Mule on, which I did quite a bit. And there was a hobbyist in my neighborhood here in Gaithersburg, Maryland, that was part of a Commodore 64 user group all these years later, and I ended up just giving that to him. Said, it's sitting in my closet, not doing anybody any good. If you have a good home for it, enjoy it.
Nice. If you could send a message to the Atari computer users, and I will make a special exception and even allow you, if you wish, to send a message to Commodore users who are listening to this podcast, what would you tell them?
Look, those were the days. It was the Wild West, especially in the 80s, when we were figuring out the business, making it up as we went along, trying to see what worked and what didn't work. It was really interesting, really a good time. But you're not getting this modern 21st century computer off my desk and giving me that old one back, because they just get better and better. I've got a beautiful 27-inch iMac on my desk, and it's awesome. I loved my time at Commodore. I downloaded I think I have both Atari and Commodore emulators and basic languages on my iPhone now that I goof around with every once in a while.
Nice.
They're kind of fun, but it's a whole different world now. One of the things I really miss is I don't write code anymore. I mean, I grew up as a coder from high school on, spent 10 years as a full-time programmer pretty much, and then did a lot of programming and documentation as time went by. But I miss it. I was really into the whole computer logic, and I still think I can think logically and think around issues the way you would think about them if you were writing code. But coding has gotten so complex where you don't just write the code, but you're calling all these outside packages and things like that. And I miss it. I'd love to figure out how to do that again. It was nice back in those days. It was simpler. It wasn't as powerful, but you could get stuff done. So it was fun. I don't often go back to those old days, although I'm still in touch with all the 100% of the Vic Commando original team through Facebook and other social media. And Andy and I are still very good friends after all these years. But most of the Atari people as well.
Well, excellent. I think I have what I need, Neil. Thank you.
Okay.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.